we basically have beer, or what we call wash, and an alcoholic liquid that's generally a little bit under 10% ABV. But we have to get it to at least 40% ABV, which is the legal minimum for Scotch whiskey. We can either do this a batch at a time in a pot still, or we do it continuously in a column still. Pot still technology goes back thousands of years, as I showed in the previous slide, whereas column stills are a more recent development, being just about 200 years old. So now we add heat to the wash. Now we know water boils at about 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. Before that, we have acetone that vaporizes at 133 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if that makes it into the bottle, do we know what happens when we drink acetone? Yes, confusion, coma, death, and possibly the worst, if you survive, I've been told, a shorter menstrual cycle is a side effect of consuming acetone as well. Then methanol will come out at about 66 degrees Celsius or 151 Fahrenheit, also not good to drink. And then finally ethanol at 173.1 degrees Fahrenheit. We have to be concerned with isopropyl alcohol, which then comes out at 177 degrees Fahrenheit. So voila, we just heat to 173.1 degrees and then we're all done. Fortunately, it's not that easy because alcohol and water bind to each other and they don't separate easily. So it isn't as simple as shown here, which is good because if we were to drink pure ethanol, it would be pretty boring. It's like nobody sips on Everclear, at least no one who watches a Scotch whiskey presentation. Right, so on to pot stills, or otherwise known as batch distillation. It's called batch distillation because, of course, it's done in batches. And in Scottish single malt whiskey, these are the only stills that can be used. Now, all stills in the Scotch whiskey industry are made of copper. It's easily shaped, it's easy to find, it's an effective conductor of heat, and it's a good catalyst, reacting with various compounds, especially in the gaseous phases. Most notably, it removes some of the sulfur compounds from the wash. So our first distillation is in a wash still. What comes out is about 20 to 25% ABV, usually takes about 4 to 7 hours. And then the pot ale is what's left over. It's about a 1% ABV. And then you clean it out and either move it to another pot, or if you clean it out, you just distill it again. Then we do a second distillation in what's called the spirit still. Now these can be identical stills. They just have a different name depending on what distillation they're doing. What comes out here in the US is called White Dog, otherwise known as New Make Spirit. Some of the whiskeys we'll be trying are actually distilled 2.5 times, where the new make gets combined and redistilled. But in this still, and at this point, there are huge quality decisions to be made. Remember those dangerous alcohols? This is where the concept of heads, hearts, and tails come into play. The heads, or in Scotland, the foreshots, are what come off first. The heart comes next, and it's primarily the cleanest spirit, and the less you take of this, the better, because it's higher quality. If you consider it this way, heads come off, then the heart starts. The tighter the heart, generally the better quality spirit you're going to have. The tails come off after that, and generally the heads and the tails go back and to be redistilled. Now, here's where you can start to begin to see why the price increases with quality spirits. If you have a large batch of raw materials and you're only taking a little bit of the heart, you have a better quality, but actually the price per ounce is going to go up. If you're making a more affordable spirit, you're going to widen that heart and you're going to be bumping up against the heads and possibly bumping up against the tails and bottling that. So, next concept to understand at this point is reflux. Reflux is a process that occurs inside the still during both distillations, but primarily the second. It greatly affects the quality of the new make spirit. The more reflux, the lighter and more refined the new make spirit will be. Conversely, less reflux leads to a heavier, oilier, and denser new make spirit. So basically what's happening is as the molecules are vaporizing, they start to move around in this still and they bounce around, and if there are shapes like this, you start to have like eddies where they will cool and they will fall back off. And every time they start to make it up and fall back down, you actually get a little bit cleaner and a little bit lighter spirit before it finally makes it up and out. Now, if that top arm leans down, the vapors get up there and then they just slide down. If the arm is up, you have greater reflux. They still can't get out until they work their way up and out there. Now, reflux is determined by the size and the shape of the still, the slope of that line arm that I mentioned, also how much volume of liquid you're putting in the still, and how fast you run these stills. Then you have additional reflux and additional copper contact as it leaves the still and gets cooled in either a worm tub or a shell and tube condenser. The shell and tube has a bunch of little tiny copper pipes inside the cooling water, and so you have more copper contact with the shell and tube. The worm tub is a single copper pipe that circles around inside a big tub to cool off. So again, more copper, more reflux, and a lighter style then comes out. Now we come to our second type of still used in Scotch whiskey production, the column still, also known as a continuous still, because rather than being done in batches, this thing runs all the time. It doesn't have to be cleaned out, it can keep running. A man named Aeneas Coffey gave his name to this. It's a coffee still. He was actually a taxman who was working with distilleries. And at this time, tax was collected through taxing malt, as it was required for whiskey production. And if you could maximize your ABV from your wash, then you could make alcohol quicker and cheaper. Now, barley flavors are generally considered the best, but with malt being taxed more than the other grains, if you could find a way not to stick with malt, you could make alcohol cheaper as well. So they figured out use a little bit of malt for the enzyme kick and let it work on whatever other grains you can find that are cheap out there. Now, when you have a still that can make an ABV of 96%, it starts to not matter so much what grain is being used because what comes out is completely neutral. There's little to no congeners or flavors that survive this. So what does one of these things look like on the inside? So on the left here, we see the analyzer, which is made up of a number of heated plates. And then on each of these plates, an actual mini distillation occurs. On the right is the rectifier, where vapors are cooled and collected. Now our cold wash enters over on the rectifier side and acts to cool the vapors that are coming from the analyzer. It then comes out at the bottom and then heads over to the analyzer where it vaporizes over and over and over again. Now it leaves here as a vapor and is cooled in the rectifier. You can see at the top of the rectifier a tube where the heads or foreshots are being collected. Then about 3/4 of the way up is another tube where the heart is taken. Then at the bottom of the rectifier, the feints or tails are pulled off and actually head back over to the analyzer to be distilled again. So what this contraption did is it opened the door for mass production of whiskey and the birth of the modern blender. What a blender could do is take a little bit of pot-stilled flavor whiskey and add lots of neutral grain spirits, and voila, you have lots more whiskey and a lot cheaper. This is where big players like Dewar's, Walker, Buchanan start to come together. And in the 1900s, they were huge producers. Actually, coincidentally, the grandparents of Diageo, which was until recently the largest distiller in the world. Now, the smaller producers who can't afford these contraptions or make their own distinctive style that costs a little bit more are pretty angry. They don't want this blended stuff even called whiskey. So we come to 1909 where we have a What is Whiskey case. And curiously, the Taft Act in the U.S. in the same year involved this same issue with bourbon. But in 1909, it's like, which is healthy? Which promotes overconsumption? And as you might expect, money wins. And the only thing coming out of 1909 was that whiskey is a spirit obtained by distillation from a mash of cereal grain saccharified by the diatase of malt. Basically using malt on cereal grains and distilled. So, in 1915, we have the first minimum age of 2 years required for Scotch whiskey, and then in 1916, it's bumped up to 3 years instead. Now, come all the way up to the present, and still 90% of all Scotch whiskey is blended.